I chose to shoot 360 because the experience of watching 360 was compelling. And the sphere, the idea of having a personal sphere, personal space, is really important in how you construct yourself as a person. When you're looking at 360, your brain doesn't have to model a rectangle in it, it has to model a sphere. And you go, where am I in the sphere? And your brain is literally doing different things. I became interested in that. I think 360 will become a popular way to deliver content because it is high verisimilitude media. That is, it looks like natural human vision. When we're experiencing 360, whether it's through a 360 rig we wear on here, or if we're swiping on our phone, or we're using a mouse on a computer, we're imagining a different model in our head. And the experience of, when you've got a rig on, of turning and having the world respond to your turning, I think is triggering new things in the brain that we haven't seen before. 360 is compelling because it is this verisimilitude of normal vision. But at the moment, you're having to wear a giant lump of plastic and technology in front of your face. That's going to go away. We don't like that. Like glasses, people try to go away glasses, you know. Start by buying, first of all, a gen-locked camera, because that's where they're at now. Like, you know, if you go and buy a rig that doesn't have syncing, you've got a whole bunch of work to do once you get the files on. So that's the first step, you're getting the files on. And let's say you have shot for a few minutes. You're talking about 7 cameras, each with gigs of data. So you end up with these giant sets of files. So once you've got all the files ready and you want to sync them, the easiest way for me was to use Pluralize. So I just drop all the files, and if I've got audio as well, drop it all into Pluralize and let Pluralize align everything and work out where it is, and export a timeline to Premiere Pro, which is what I'm using to put it all together. Then you've got to take it into I use the color system from that's now owned by GoPro, Color, K-O-L-O-R. French company, I think, and I can run that on a Mac. And so when you bring things into there, all that sort of timeline positioning you get with the audio from Pluralize you can't just take that and stick that in Auto Pano Video Pro. You've got to actually go in there and run another little feature of 360 Cam Man, is that you plug in the values for what frame this camera starts and what frame that camera starts and what frame that camera starts. And then after plugging all those 7 things in, it gives you new numbers that when you go to Auto Pano Video, you plug those in so that piece of software knows. So there's this manual process going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And then Auto Pano Video essentially has got this spread of stuff, and the important thing to recognise is that you're dealing with physics. You know, camera operation, lens operation is all about the physics of light. And one of the things you've probably noticed by looking at 360 is you can sometimes see stitch lines. So it's important. One of the things you've got to do when you shoot is be thinking about how far away from the rig everybody is, because depending on that distance, if, for example, most of my action is happening around 2 meters from the camera, for example, then if I keep people there, then when I stitch, I can stitch so that I'm correcting for parallax, which is where you see the stitch lines at that level. But if I've got stuff going on in the background that's moving around as well, right, I might end up with stitch lines there. This stuff will be fine, the stuff in close, but I'll end up with stitch lines there. And in Auto Pano Video Pro, there are, and it took me so long to find this, there are ways to essentially stitch for foreground, midground and background. And in the end, you might need to do multiple stitchings, right? So you stitch initially for the foreground, then you stitch for the background, and you've got 2 layers that when you take them back into Final Cut or your video editor, you might go, okay, so I want to get rid of that stitch line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mask off the foreground stitch so that the background stitch comes through, because the background stitch in that point there does not have the parallax problem. And so you've got this elaborate kind of juggling act to do. Then you've got camera control. So, you can control where a person is looking in the scene. And to some extent, you can make people sick by doing that. Like if I could very easily, move you around a scene in a way that makes you nauseous. If you're trapped inside a rig, you've got to be cautious about that. And that's quite a complex thing. And there's this very important value called RMS, root mean square, which is about a calculated value about all of the sync points between all these cameras. And so when you've got a stitch problem, you need to go into AutoPano Giga. So you essentially take a snapshot of the point where you've got your stitch problem, goes into this editor called AutoPano Giga, and in there you do all this work around moving slightly the anchor points that determine how two cameras stitch together. What's important is to set up your shots so that you have the minimum amount of parallax problems that you can imagine. If you can just avoid, it's like any shoot, you just avoid the problem before it gets in the can. If you're interested in 360 AR, VR, in fact, probably best to call it spherical video, get a less expensive camera and learn how it works. Get whatever you can afford with sync built in. There's some interesting players. There's quite a lot of 360 cameras around now. You need to as part of this, you need to sort of understand something like ambisonic audio, which is audio that's captured with the express purpose of feeding it into post-processing that allows you to create to image the sound in a three-dimensional space. Download some software. Now, if you haven't already got a Mac, if you're really serious about 360, really you're talking about Windows, because if you wanted to go down the colour suite route, and I don't use anything but that because I am on a Mac, if you're doing it on a Windows machine, you probably end up with a faster post-processing.